One thing that has irked me, and irked me especially in 2020 during the George Floyd protests and riots and so forth, was when people from relatively homogenous European countries would look at America and say, what the hell is wrong with you guys? What is up with your cops killing Black people unarmed and the level of rampant racism in your society? We have everything figured out over here, at least compared to you guys. And what irked me about this was not that I think America has no problems to solve and no persisting inequalities and no problem with the cops. There's huge problems with the cops. But what bothered me about it is that I feel many societies have, quote unquote, solved this problem by carefully negotiating so that they don't actually have to deal with it to begin with, which is to say, if you form a country around a specific ethnic group, right? Like Sweden is for Swedes, Finland is for Finns. These are not just countries, they're actually names of ethnicities built into the country. And then you put borders around that ethnicity and integrate very other few ethnicities over, several hundred years. Well, then it's pretty easy to maintain racial harmony because you're using, as they say, good fences to make good neighbors. Whereas America and Canada, to an extent, because it was initially a nation of immigrants, has always had a totally different set of challenges. So that's one thing that irked me. But your book got me to consider that the challenge America has been facing is increasingly the challenge the developed world faces. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so let me talk about the difference between the two cases, but then also some of the similarities. Because I think you're exactly right, but I grew up in Europe and I find the sort of European anti-Americanism to be just very easy and tired, right? It often relies on cliches. There's lots of things to criticize about America, but there's also lots of things to criticize about Europe. And Europeans can sometimes be very quick to judge America on its flaws without being commensurately aware of its own flaws. And it is one of the strange ironies of the summer of 2020 that there was these big, in many ways well-intentioned, in many ways moving anti-racist movements all across Europe focused on a problem an ocean away, when European societies have their own problems of racism and discrimination, but somehow weren't at the forefront of those debates. And so actually, you could often see an element of smug moral superiority that is unearned in the way that these protests took place in Europe, saying these Americans over there are terrible, but of course we are much better, right? Having studied the history of these diverse societies and some of the ways in which they go wrong, there's three main modes of failure. There's fragmentation, there's anarchy, and there's domination. But Europe and America have historically had slightly different forms of domination. So in Europe, it's what I call a form of soft domination. How did Germany solve the challenge of making diverse democracies work after World War II? Well, very easily. It wasn't a very diverse society because of the Holocaust and because of ethnic cleansing and because of expulsions, because of all those processes. The society was just really homogeneous. And so, yes, the rules from the beginning were inclusive, but the reality wasn't inclusive because there wasn't anybody to include. And once immigrants started to come in, they often were treated as non-citizens or as second-class citizens. They were not giving a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of informal prejudices and so on and so forth, right? The United States has a different set of problems, which is that of the long-lasting legacy of hard domination, which is to say that, of course, for centuries, people in the United States were enslaved, and for much longer after that, they were discriminated against in Jim Crow and other forms. And that continues to structure our society today in some important ways. I think there's a lot of simplistic talk about structural racism and so on, but the fact that, of course, today's reality in the United States continues to be shaped by that past is obvious. And so when you think of something like relations between whites and African Americans, or whites and Black people in Europe as well, I think that's an interesting distinction. I don't know whether you share perception, Coleman, but in the United States, there is some deep racism that exists. It's thankfully a minority position now, but because of all of that history, there are a good number of whites who really do have strongly racist views against African Americans. And it's a hatred that goes deep, and it's a hatred of something that's in an odd way familiar. But I also think that a lot of Americans and white Americans have an understanding of the complexities of class in Black America, for example. They're actually relatively good, not always as good as they might be, but relatively good at reading the difference between a Black person who's grown up in a really deprived neighborhood and a Black person who's going to a fancy college. I think in Europe, you have a different kind of form of racism. So that sort of hatred of a known isn't really there because there have been so few Black people historically, at least in countries like Germany and Italy and so on. In some countries like France, there's been more Black people for a longer time. But I also know from my friends who are immigrants from Africa to Germany and Italy and those places, that actually in some ways they feel more comfortable in the United States because if they're middle class, in America, people sort of recognize who they are as middle class, and even though they face certain disadvantages, they also are sort of treated normally as belonging in other ways. Whereas in Europe, they're always exotic and they're always treated with a sort of generalized set of prejudices and so on of, they probably barely speak the language and they're probably uneducated and so on and so forth. Because, Europeans are just much less familiar with the Black middle class, for example. And so I think that, you can understand a lot about the societies today by looking at those different historical trajectories. I haven't yet answered part of your question, which is what makes this moment sort of different in those countries. And I actually think in some ways they're getting more similar, which is to say that, Germany in 1950 was very, very homogeneous. Even when I grew up there in the 90s, it still really felt like a very homogeneous society. But actually today, there's about as many foreign-born people in Germany as there are in the United States. And there's some European countries where the number of foreign-born people is now higher than it is in the United States. Even a country like Switzerland, which you think of as quite sort of sleepy and so on, right? And so some of the fundamental challenge of how do you deal with the coexistence of all of these different ethnic and religious groups is now the same in Europe as it is in the United States, despite those different histories.
Yeah, so one big difference, or one big consequence of slavery and Jim Crow is simply the memory of slavery and Jim Crow, the historical memory of slavery and Jim Crow, the fact that, some 90% of Black people in America, including myself, are the only group in the country that didn't come here by choice. And we know that. And so there's always this primordial grievance that can be pointed to, and therefore a primordial guilt that can be felt until the end of time, until the end of America, by Black people and white people who've been here for a long time, respectively. And European countries, many of whom had many, many slaves, had it's strange to say good luck, and I'm not even sure it really is good luck, but they kept their slaves overseas. And so when they dissolved their empires and when slavery was abolished in the 19th century, they didn't have the problem America had, which is the guy who was a slave yesterday is now living next to the man that enslaved him, and his kids are living near the kids of the slave masters, and the race that was enslaved has to live with the race that was just enslaving them. And the resentments, just like the fertile ground for resentment and guilt and, ethnic entrepreneur politicians to whip up grievances till the end of time, that gasoline is there in America till the end of time in a way that it's not in Europe. And it's not the same. The psychology of immigrants is not the same. They're coming by choice. Whatever discrimination they face is implicitly balanced against the sum total of what they're leaving at home and the opportunities they had there. There's a baseline level of gratitude usually because why else would you come to a place? And that makes our challenge really difficult. And this gets into something else. So, we've basically alluded to the threat from the right, which is essentially white racism, nativism, maybe populism, depending on how one defines that term. And my understanding from looking at, polls and other data is roughly 10% of Americans will agree with straight up racist views about Black people. Like, I don't want my child marrying a Black person, right? That's like 1 in 10, which is, I suppose depending on your worldview, is either surprisingly high or surprisingly low. And there could be some hiding of views, but I sort of take that at face value. So that's the threat from the right, is that sentiment and politicians that weaponize it. And then the threat from the left, and you talk about this in your book, is, to me, narratives like the 1619 Project, right? Which essentially use that gasoline of, resentment and whips it up through some outright falsehoods, such as that white people basically played no role in the abolition of slavery and Jim Crow, or that the country was founded in part to preserve slavery. And so can you talk about what is the threat from the left to diverse democracies?
So I think the main threat is actually the deep embrace of what a really thoughtful scholar who actually came to regret coining the term and came to dissociate herself from it, Beatrice Spivak, calls strategic essentialism. And so the idea here is that, a lot of people on the left for a long time are really skeptical and critical of these identity categories, right? They thought, hey, the way that Marxists used to talk about the proletariat and all of that actually doesn't really make sense. It's simplifying these categories. Things are much more complicated than that. These are not natural kinds. And so we should actually disaggregate groups in these ways. But then a set of people started to worry, well, hang on a second, if we do that, it makes it harder to fight against oppression. And perhaps it's fine for sort of the white worker in the streets of Paris, but it's not fine, for example, for the voiceless people in India. That was Spivak's argument. And so even though we recognize that categories like people of color are really artificial, that they kind of don't really describe the world very accurately, we should embrace them in a strategic manner. We should speak as though this essentialist account of identity were correct, in order to be able to organize political protests along those lines and sort of fight back against injustice. Now, in a way, I get the point of that, right? If you live in a society that's discriminating against people on the basis of those artificial identity groups, at some point you've got to say, well, we might think these identity groups are artificial, but nevertheless, we should organize as the people who are affected by this in order to fight back. But the problem is that the strategic element and strategic essentialism very quickly fell away. And so the way that a lot of the left talks about these things today, there's lip service to the strategic element, right? You still see that even in some of the sort of more extreme reaches of quote unquote woke discourse, you see this sort of like, well, of course, identity is all socially constructed. That's sort of like the lip service to the element of it being a strategic essentialism. But then for all intents and purposes, they're actually treated in a deeply essentialist manner. And they think that it's an unalloyed good to structure society, to structure the main media institutions, to structure the main educational institutions in such a way as to encourage Americans to define themselves by these identity categories. And for me, the clearest example of that is the thing that most elite private schools in the country now do, that Dalton and Horace Mann do in New York City, that Sidwell Friends does in Washington, D.C., of taking kids who might be 10 years old or 8 years old or 6 years old and putting these into different so-called affinity groups. So the teacher comes in and he says, you're African-American, you're Asian American, you're Latino, you're white. You go off into your separate groups. And then the hope is that you will learn to have political consciousness and to fight back against the injustices you suffer as various categories of people of color.